Welcome to the Sleepy Stoic. Tonight, we journey to a place where philosophy meets its ultimate test. Not in the comfort of a library, not in the safety of a lecture hall, but on the frozen banks of the Danube River, amid the chaos of war. Here, an emperor sits by firelight, writing words that will echo through centuries. Marcus Aurelius, philosopher king, warrior thinker, finds himself at the edge of the Roman Empire, leading campaigns against Germanic tribes who threaten the realm he never asked to rule. The year is somewhere between 170 and 180 AD. The exact moment matters less than what that moment contains. Picture the scene with me, gently, without strain. A military camp stretches across the landscape, thousands of men seeking rest after another brutal day. The air carries the smell of smoke, leather, and earth. Sentries walk their posts. Horses shift in their enclosures. And in the commander's tent, Marcus Aurelius sits with a simple writing tablet, composing what we now call the Meditations. He does not write for publication. He does not write for history. He writes for himself, in Greek, the language of philosophy, attempting to maintain his inner fortress while the world around him demands violence, decisiveness, and the hardness required of a wartime leader. These private notes become something extraordinary precisely because they emerge from such pressure. They are philosophy not as theory, but as survival tool. Not as intellectual exercise, but as necessary practice. We often encounter Stoicism in comfortable moments. We read Marcus Aurelius in bed, perhaps, or listen to philosophical discussions during peaceful commutes. We contemplate virtue and wisdom when life permits contemplation. But Marcus wrote his most enduring words while managing a war that would span years of his life. He wrote about tranquility while men died under his command. He reflected on the interconnectedness of all humanity while ordering the destruction of enemy positions. He reminded himself of mortality while sending others toward their deaths. This context changes everything. The Meditations are not abstract musings. They are field notes from the front lines of existence, written by someone who cannot escape the weight of consequence. Every decision Marcus makes affects thousands of lives. Every moment of hesitation might cost Roman lives. Every act of mercy might be seen as weakness. Every display of strength might corrupt his soul. He stands at the intersection of philosophy and power, theory and practice, the man he wishes to be and the emperor's circumstances demand. Consider what this means for us here, now, in our own time. We face our own battles, though perhaps not with swords and shields. We encounter our own chaos, our own pressure, our own moments when philosophy must prove itself useful or be abandoned as pleasant fiction. Marcus in war becomes Marcus in truth, philosophy tested by fire, and his words survive because they were forged in such heat. Tonight, we explore this testing ground. We examine what it means to maintain philosophical practice when circumstances make such practice seem impossible or even absurd. What use is Stoicism on a battlefield? What good are meditations on virtue when men are dying? How does one contemplate the cosmic order while managing the disorder of war? These questions are not historical curiosities. They illuminate the very purpose of philosophy, to provide stability when everything else becomes unstable. We begin with the man himself before the war, before the weight became unbearable. Marcus Aurelius was never meant to be emperor in the usual sense. He was adopted into the imperial succession, yes, but he approached the role with reluctance rather than ambition. His training under various Stoic teachers, particularly Junius Rusticus, shaped him into someone who valued wisdom over power, reflection over action, philosophy over politics. When he became emperor in 161 AD, he inherited not just an empire but a philosophical challenge: how to rule justly while remaining true to Stoic principles. The early years of his reign brought plague, flood, and the constant pressure of imperial administration. But nothing prepared him for the Marcomannic Wars, the conflict that would define the latter portion of his life and reign. Germanic tribes and other groups crossed the Danube frontier, threatening Rome's northern provinces. What began as border skirmishes escalated into a full-scale war requiring the emperor's personal attention. Marcus, who likely preferred his philosophy books to military campaigns, found himself commanding armies, making strategic decisions, and living in military camps far from Rome's comforts. Imagine the transition from the relative civilization of Rome, with its baths, libraries, and philosophical discussions, to the crude conditions of a military frontier. From the company of scholars to the company of soldiers. From contemplation to action. From theoretical virtue to virtue tested by consequence. This shift would break many people. It would force them to abandon their philosophical commitments as impractical luxuries. But Marcus did something remarkable. He brought his philosophy with him. He continued his practice, writing by campfire, reflecting between battles, maintaining his inner work even as external chaos raged. The meditations themselves reveal this context in countless ways. Marcus writes about enduring cold and hardship. He reminds himself that discomfort is natural and should be expected. He reflects on the mortality of warriors and the temporary nature of military glory. He contemplates the futility of conquest even as he directs conquests. These are not contradictions but the honest record of someone trying to reconcile duty with wisdom, obligation with philosophy, the emperor's role with the philosopher's soul. Consider Book 2 of the Meditations, likely written during these campaigns. Marcus begins by reminding himself to expect difficulty from others. He tells himself that people will be meddling, ungrateful, violent, treacherous, envious, and unsociable. But rather than letting this embitter him, he frames it philosophically. These people act this way from ignorance of good and evil. They are his relatives in a cosmic sense, not through blood but through shared rationality. He cannot be harmed by them because harm exists only in his judgments, not in external events. This is philosophy under pressure. Not the philosophy of an armchair theorist, but of someone who must deal with actual meddling people, actual violence, actual betrayal. Marcus writes these reminders because he needs them. The war brings him into contact with human nature at its worst. Ambition, cruelty, cowardice, and self-interest. Without his philosophical framework, he might become cynical or brutal. With it, he maintains perspective, remembering that even difficult people deserve understanding, that judgment should be reserved, that virtue remains possible even in dark circumstances. The question emerges naturally: why write at all? When exhausted from battle planning, when surrounded by military concerns, when sleep is scarce and demands are endless, why take time for philosophical writing? Marcus could have abandoned his practice. No one would have blamed him. War provides a perfect excuse to set aside such refined pursuits. Yet he persists, and this persistence reveals something essential about Stoicism itself. Philosophy, for the Stoics, is not an academic discipline or intellectual hobby. It is a way of life, a practical art, a daily practice necessary for human flourishing. The Greek word they used, askesis, implies exercise or training, like an athlete preparing for competition. Marcus writes not to create literature but to train his mind, to reinforce proper perspectives, to maintain his philosophical conditioning. The war makes this practice more necessary, not less. The chaos makes the training more urgent, not optional. Think of it as a lighthouse keeper maintaining the light during a storm. When seas are calm, the light's importance seems minimal. Ships can navigate by starlight, by familiarity, by instruments. But when the storm comes, when visibility drops and waves threaten, the lighthouse becomes essential. The keeper must tend the light precisely when conditions make the work most difficult. Marcus tends his philosophical light during the storm of war because that is when he most needs its guidance. The writing itself serves multiple purposes. Clarifies thought. It externalizes inner dialogue, making it visible and examinable. It creates a record that can be reviewed, a touchstone to return to when memory falters or emotion overwhelms. When Marcus writes, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. He is not discovering this truth for the first time. He knows this Stoic principle intimately, but knowing and remembering are different things, especially under pressure. The act of writing makes the principle present and real again. Moreover, the writing creates distance from immediate circumstances. When immersed in military crisis, everything seems urgent. Everything demands instant reaction. But taking time to write philosophically interrupts this reactive pattern. It inserts a pause, a gap between stimulus and response. In that gap, wisdom becomes possible. Marcus steps back from the emperor's role, from the general's burden, and reconnects with the philosopher's perspective. He reminds himself that these wars, however large they loom in present experience, are tiny moments in cosmic time. The universe proceeds according to its rational order regardless of whether Rome wins or loses specific battles. This shift in perspective is not escapism. Marcus does not use philosophy to avoid his responsibilities. Rather, philosophy enables him to fulfill those responsibilities more wisely. By remembering the big picture, he avoids the short-sighted decisions that fear or anger might produce. By maintaining his inner citadel, he remains capable of judgment even under extreme stress. By practicing virtue through writing, he strengthens the very qualities he needs for leadership: justice, courage, moderation, and wisdom. The campfire becomes his classroom. The military tent becomes his philosophical academy. The war itself becomes the curriculum, providing endless opportunities to practice principles, test theories, and refine understanding. This is Stoicism as originally conceived, not as abstract doctrine but as lived practice, not as theory about virtue but as virtue attempted in real conditions. We must also understand the profound loneliness of Marcus's position. An emperor, especially during war, exists in a unique isolation. Everyone around him has agendas, needs, or fears that color their interactions. Generals want resources for their campaigns. Advisors compete for influence. Soldiers need to see strength and certainty, not philosophical doubt. Even well-meaning companions cannot fully share the burden of command. The decisions are his alone. The responsibility cannot be delegated. The weight cannot be shared. In this isolation, the writing becomes a companion. Marcus converses with himself, but also with the Stoic tradition, with the wisdom of Epictetus and earlier teachers. He is not alone because he carries philosophy with him, an internal dialogue partner that asks useful questions and provides considered responses. When he writes, he accesses something larger than his individual perspective. He taps into centuries of philosophical thought about virtue, duty, and the good life. Consider the strange intimacy of these writings. They were never meant for other eyes. Marcus did not compose them thinking future generations would analyze every phrase. This was his private practice, his personal training ground, his internal workshop. Yet this privacy gives the meditations their power. We read someone's honest struggle, not their public performance. We encounter the gap between aspiration and achievement, the effort to become better, the repeated reminders, because one reminder is never enough. He writes knowing he will fail. This is crucial to understand. Marcus is not writing as a perfected sage who has conquered all passions and achieved complete virtue. He is writing as someone who struggles, who falls short, who needs constant reminding of principles he theoretically accepts but practically forgets. When he tells himself not to be angry at others' faults, we can infer he struggles with anger. When he reminds himself that death is natural and nothing to fear, we sense his own fear needing confrontation. The writing reveals both his ideals and his humanity. This honesty makes the meditations more useful, not less. If Marcus were writing as a perfected sage, his words might inspire but also discourage. How could ordinary people achieve what a philosopher-emperor found easy? But his struggle, his repeated returns to the same themes, his obvious need for philosophical reinforcement, all of this makes the practice accessible. Philosophy is not about reaching permanent perfection, but about continuous practice. It is not about never falling, but about rising each time, returning to principles, beginning again. The war amplifies this pattern. Each day brings new challenges to his composure. A general brings bad news. Supplies run short. Weather delays plans. An expected ally proves unreliable. Men die in numbers that become statistics but were once individuals. Marcus must process all this while maintaining the appearance of certainty and control. Leadership demands a mask. Philosophy allows him to remove it, at least briefly, in the privacy of his writing practice. He examines his reactions with unflinching honesty. Did he respond to that setback with appropriate calm, or did anger rise? When that subordinate failed in his duty, did Marcus judge harshly or remember human fallibility? When facing danger, did he meet it with courage, or did fear compromise his judgment? These are not rhetorical questions. They are genuine self-examination, the philosopher studying himself as he would study any natural phenomenon, with curiosity and attention to detail. The tension between private philosophy and public duty creates fascinating complexity. Marcus the philosopher knows that externals are indifferent, that only virtue matters, that rational order governs the cosmos. But Marcus the emperor must care deeply about externals. He must care whether Rome wins or loses. He must care about territory, supplies, military discipline, and political stability. He must make decisions that treat some outcomes as genuinely better than others, even while his philosophy tells him that external outcomes are neither truly good nor truly bad. How does he reconcile this apparent contradiction? The Stoic answer lies in understanding preferred indifference. Health is not truly good in the philosophical sense, because it does not make one virtuous. But health is reasonably preferred to illness. Victory is not truly good, but it is reasonably preferred to defeat. The wise person distinguishes between what matters ultimately and what matters practically. Marcus can pursue victory without believing victory makes him better or defeat would make him worse in the only sense that ultimately matters: his character. This distinction allows him to fulfill his role without losing his soul. He can wage war without becoming a warmonger. He can seek victory without being corrupted by ambition. He can exercise power without becoming power-hungry. The philosophy provides the internal standard against which he measures himself, independent of external outcomes. A battle lost does not make him a worse person if he responded to the loss with virtue. A battle won does not make him better if he responded to victory with arrogance or cruelty. Consider the remarkable psychological freedom this provides. Most leaders become slaves to outcomes. They need to win to feel valuable. They need recognition to feel worthy. They need power to feel secure. But Marcus, however imperfectly, works to root his value in something outcomes cannot touch: his character, his choices, his virtue. The war can take many things from him: exhaustion, comfort, time, even life, but it cannot take his moral agency unless he surrenders it through vicious choices. This is the inner citadel that Stoicism builds. Not a physical fortress, but a psychological one. External circumstances form the outer walls, constantly under siege, sometimes breached, always vulnerable. But the inner citadel remains secure as long as one maintains proper judgment. Marcus can lose battles without losing himself. He can face setbacks without being set back in what matters most. He can endure hardship without being hardened in the wrong ways. The writing reinforces the citadel. Each time Marcus reminds himself of Stoic principles, he strengthens the walls. Each time he examines his reactions and corrects poor judgments, he repairs damage. Each time he reconnects with the rational order of nature, he remembers that his citadel is not isolated but part of a larger whole. He is not alone in a hostile universe but a rational being in a rational cosmos, however chaotic immediate circumstances appear. Yet we must not romanticize this process. The citadel requires constant maintenance. The writing suggests not mastery but struggle. Marcus must repeatedly remind himself of truths he already knows because knowing is not enough. The passions rise despite philosophy. Anger, fear, frustration, grief, all these natural human responses continue to emerge. Stoicism does not eliminate them but provides tools to work with them, to prevent them from driving behavior, to maintain choice even in their presence. As we prepare to move deeper into this exploration, consider what Marcus's example offers us. We are not emperors commanding armies. We do not face his specific circumstances, but we all encounter situations where philosophy is tested by pressure. We all have moments when our principles meet challenging reality. We all know the gap between who we wish to be and who we actually become under stress. Marcus shows us that philosophy is not about eliminating this gap, but about working with it. The practice is not to achieve permanent perfection, but to maintain continuous effort. We will fall short. We will fail to embody our principles in many moments. We will react poorly, judge harshly, let emotions drive behavior. This is human. What matters is returning to practice, examining what happened, understanding our reactions, and preparing to do better next time. The war provides extreme circumstances, but this actually clarifies something important. If philosophy works in war, it works anywhere. If Stoic principles help Marcus maintain composure while men die under his command, they can certainly help us maintain composure in our considerably less dramatic challenges. The test case is severe, which makes the demonstration more convincing. We cannot dismiss Stoicism as fair-weather philosophy, useful only when life is easy. Marcus proves its utility precisely when life is hardest. His writing also demonstrates that philosophical practice need not be elaborate. Marcus does not have access to his library. He cannot engage in lengthy discussions with other philosophers. He cannot attend lectures or retreat to quiet contemplation. He simply writes, briefly, in whatever time he can steal from military duties. The practice is simple but consistent. This simplicity makes it sustainable even under difficulty. We can adopt this approach in our own lives. We need not wait for ideal circumstances to begin philosophical practice. We need not have perfect understanding before starting. We can begin where we are with what we have in whatever time is available. A few minutes of reflection, a few sentences written, a conscious pause to examine our judgments. These small practices accumulate over time into something substantial. They build our own inner citadel, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. The context of Marcus' writing during war also reminds us that philosophy serves life, not the other way around. We do not live in order to philosophize perfectly. We philosophize in order to live better, to fulfill our roles more wisely, to maintain our humanity under pressure. The philosophy is tool, not end. It serves our flourishing, our ability to face circumstances with virtue and wisdom. As we continue, we will explore how Marcus applies specific Stoic teachings to his situation. We will examine his reflections on mortality, duty, nature, and human community. We will see how philosophy shapes his leadership and how leadership tests his philosophy. We will discover the practices that sustain him and the insights that emerge from his struggle. But always, we will remember that these are not abstract ideas but lived attempts, not theories about virtue but virtue pursued in the midst of chaos. The fire burns low in the camp. Marcus sets down his stylus. Tomorrow brings more decisions, more difficulties, more opportunities to practice philosophy or abandon it. For now, he has done what he can. Returned to principles, examined his thoughts, reinforced his understanding. The writing does not solve his problems, but it helps him face them with clearer sight and steadier purpose. And that, in the end, is all philosophy promises. Not to eliminate life's challenges, but to help us meet them as we truly wish to be. The Danube moves slowly in winter, a gray ribbon beneath gray skies. Along its banks, Roman camps stretched for miles during the Marcomannic Wars, settlements of leather and timber where tens of thousands of men lived and died far from home. Marcus Aurelius arrived on the frontier in the year 170, expecting perhaps a brief campaign, a show of force to remind the Germanic tribes of Roman power. He could not have known he would spend the better part of the next decade here, that these cold northern lands would become more familiar to him than the marble halls of Rome. The frontier was not what most Romans imagined. It was not a clean line on a map, but a living boundary, constantly shifting, perpetually contested. Villages changed hands with the seasons. Loyalties were complex, fluid, sometimes purchased, sometimes coerced. Marcus had to learn this landscape not just geographically but politically, psychologically. He had to understand not only where the enemy might strike, but why, what motivated them, what they feared, what they valued. This was not the philosophy he had practiced in the quiet of his study. This was philosophy in mud and blood, in the crying of wounded men and the smoke of burning settlements. The Stoic principles he had studied since youth, the teachings of Epictetus and Chrysippus, the wisdom of Zeno, all of it had to prove itself here or be revealed as empty words, as consolations suited only to comfort. We must understand what Marcus brought with him to the frontier. He came as a man in his late 40s, his health already declining, his body afflicted by the pains that would plague him for the rest of his life. He came as an emperor who had inherited a crisis, as plagues swept through the empire and enemies pressed at multiple borders. He came also as a philosopher who had spent decades training his mind, developing habits of thought that he hoped would sustain him. The question that faced him, the question that faces anyone who attempts to live philosophically, was whether this training meant anything when tested. Could philosophical practice truly transform a person? Could it provide real stability in genuine chaos? Or was it merely an intellectual exercise, a pleasant hobby for peaceful times? Marcus had with him, we can imagine, some version of what would become his meditations, though whether it was a single codex or loose sheets of papyrus or wax tablets, we cannot know for certain. What we do know is that he wrote during these campaigns. The internal evidence of the text makes this clear. He references the camps, the frontier, the pressures of command. He writes like a man reminding himself of truths that are in danger of being forgotten. This is the first thing we must grasp about the Meditations. It is not a treatise written for posterity. It is not philosophy performed for an audience. It is private writing, perhaps never intended to be read by others at all. It is Marcus talking to himself, working through doubts, reinforcing convictions, trying to maintain his practice under conditions that made practice nearly impossible. Consider what his days must have been like. He woke in a military tent to the sounds of an army camp, tens of thousands of men preparing for the day's work. There were reports to hear, decisions to make, petitions to consider, conflicts to resolve. He commanded not just soldiers but the entire civil administration of the army, the logistics and supply lines, the diplomacy with allied tribes, the correspondence with Rome and with governors across the empire. As emperor, even on campaign, he could not escape the paperwork of rule. Messengers arrived constantly with letters requiring his attention, his signature, his judgment. Legal cases were referred to him, administrative questions, requests for appointments, grants of citizenship, pardons, confirmations of wills, disputes over property rights. The machinery of empire did not pause because the emperor was at war. And beyond the administrative burden, there was the actual conduct of war. Marcus had to make decisions that would determine whether men lived or died, whether villages were spared or burned, whether to accept terms of peace or press an advantage. These were not abstract ethical problems. They were immediate, concrete choices with consequences he could see and smell and hear. The Stoics taught that externals do not determine our happiness, that the only true good is virtue and the only true evil is vice. But what does this mean when you must decide whether to order an attack that will cost hundreds of lives? What does it mean when you receive reports of atrocities committed by the enemy or by your own troops? What does it mean when plague sweeps through your camp and men die not gloriously in battle but wretchedly in their own filth? These questions could not be answered with philosophical formulas. They required something deeper, a transformation of character that went beyond intellectual understanding. Marcus needed to have internalized Stoic principles so thoroughly that they functioned not as rules he followed but as the very structure of his thinking, his perceiving, his responding to the world. This is what makes the Meditations so remarkable as a philosophical document. It records the effort to maintain this transformation under maximum pressure. We see Marcus not as a serene sage but as a human being struggling, reminding himself of what he knows, talking himself back to sanity when the chaos threatens to overwhelm him. Take one of the most famous passages from the Meditations from the second book, where Marcus reminds himself at the beginning of each day that he will encounter difficult people, the busybody, the ungrateful, the arrogant, the deceitful. This is not abstract moralizing. This is a man preparing himself for the day ahead, knowing that he will face these types, that he will be frustrated, that he will be tempted to anger or contempt or despair. And his response is not to deny these frustrations or to pretend they do not matter. Instead, he reminds himself that these people act from ignorance of what is truly good, that they are his kin, that he cannot be harmed by them because harm comes only from within, from his own judgments. This is practical philosophy, a tool he uses to shape his responses before the situations arise. But we must not imagine that this was easy, that Marcus simply recited these principles and found immediate peace. The very fact that he writes these reminders repeatedly, that he returns to the same themes again and again throughout the Meditations, tells us that this was hard work. He had to remind himself constantly because the pull of anger, frustration, and despair was constant. In war, everything accelerates. The stakes are higher, the pressures more intense, the opportunities for failure more numerous. A bad decision in peacetime might lead to inefficiency or minor injustice. A bad decision in war leads to death, to wasted lives, to the kind of suffering that haunts a commander for the rest of his days. Marcus understood this weight. We see it in his writing, in the way he reminds himself that death is natural, that it comes to all, that we must accept it without drama or fear. But this is not cold indifference. It is the effort of a man who has sent thousands to their deaths trying to make peace with that necessity, trying to hold onto his humanity while performing the duties of command. The Stoics distinguished between what is up to us and what is not up to us. This is the fundamental distinction of Stoic ethics, the dichotomy of control that structures all their practical advice. What is up to us is our own judgments, our own choices, our own responses to what happens. What is not up to us is everything external, including the outcomes of our actions. This principle is easy to state and extraordinarily difficult to live by. It requires us to care deeply about what we do while simultaneously releasing our attachment to results. We must act with full commitment, with excellence, with virtue, and then accept whatever consequences follow. For Marcus in war, this meant planning campaigns carefully, making the best decisions he could with the information available, and then accepting that many things remained beyond his control. Weather would turn, intelligence would prove false, allies would fail to arrive, Enemies would do the unexpected. Men would die despite all precautions. And somehow he had to maintain his equilibrium through all of this, to remain rational, just courageous and moderate even as chaos unfolded around him. We might ask how he managed this, what specific practices sustained him. The Meditations gives us glimpses into his method. We see him beginning each day with philosophical reflection, preparing his mind for what lies ahead. We see him returning to first principles when confused, reminding himself of the Stoic understanding of the cosmos, of nature, of what it means to be a rational being. He writes frequently about nature, about understanding events as natural processes rather than personal affronts. When something frustrates him, he tries to see it as the inevitable working out of cause and effect in a rational universe. This is not fatalism, not passive acceptance of whatever happens. Rather, it is an attempt to contextualize events, to see them as part of larger patterns, to resist the narcissistic interpretation that makes everything about him personally. This practice becomes especially important in war, where events can feel overwhelmingly personal. When an attack fails, when men die under your command, when plans go wrong despite your best efforts, the temptation is to take it personally, to see it as your failure, to be crushed by guilt or shame or anger. Marcus had to find a way to acknowledge his responsibility while not being destroyed by it. The Stoic concept of preferred indifference helped with this. The Stoics taught that most things we care about, health, wealth, reputation, even life itself, are indifferents. They are not good or evil in themselves. What matters is how we use them, how we respond to their presence or absence. We should prefer health to sickness, life to death, victory to defeat, but we should not stake our happiness on obtaining these preferences. For a military commander, this is crucial wisdom. Marcus preferred to win battles, to preserve the lives of his soldiers, to protect Roman territory and citizens. These were rational preferences, and he worked tirelessly toward them. But his peace of mind, his virtue, his character could not depend on achieving them. He had to be able to do his best and then accept whatever resulted without losing his center. This is extraordinarily demanding. It asks us to care without being attached, to try without being dependent on success, to give everything while holding nothing. It is, in many ways, the heart of Stoic practice, and it is something most of us struggle with even in ordinary circumstances. For Marcus, facing the demands of war, it was the only way forward. We see him wrestling with this in his writing. He reminds himself that fame is meaningless, that posterity's judgment is empty, that even the greatest empires crumble and are forgotten. This is not nihilism but an attempt to free himself from the tyranny of outcome. If even empire itself is ultimately impermanent, then surely the success or failure of this campaign or that decision cannot be what his worth as a person depends upon. What he can control, what he must focus on, is his own character. Can he remain just? Can he make decisions based on reason rather than passion? Can he treat even enemies with a kind of respect, recognizing their humanity even as he opposes them? Can he avoid cruelty, vengeance, the petty satisfactions of power? These are the questions that matter, and they are all questions about his own choices, his own judgments, the only domain where he has real control. This focus on character over outcome is one of the most radical and most difficult aspects of Stoic philosophy. We are trained from childhood to measure ourselves by results, by achievements, by what we produce and win and accumulate. The Stoics ask us to measure ourselves instead by who we are, by the quality of our choices regardless of their consequences. In war, this distinction becomes life or death, not just physically but spiritually. A commander who depends on victory for his sense of worth will be destroyed by defeat. He will take foolish risks to avoid losing, will become cruel in his desperation, will sacrifice what should not be sacrificed to preserve what cannot be preserved. Marcus had seen this, had read of it in history, knew the pattern. He had to avoid it, so he trained himself day by day to relocate his sense of value. Not in winning but in trying rightly. Not in the outcomes he could not control but in the efforts he could. Not in what others thought of him but in what he actually was, in the privacy of his own mind, in the truth that no one else could see but that mattered more than all external judgment. This is the work we see him doing in the Meditations. He is building what the Stoics called the inner citadel, a place of refuge within himself that no external force can touch. This citadel is not built of stone but of judgments, of principles internalized so deeply that they become automatic. When everything external crumbles, when defeat looms, when the body fails, when even life itself is threatened, the inner citadel remains, impregnable not because it is strong but because it is not made of anything that can be attacked. Consider how radical this idea is. Marcus was the most powerful man in the known world, the emperor of Rome at the height of its power. He commanded the greatest military force ever assembled. He had access to unlimited wealth, to every comfort, to the service of millions. And yet he spent his time building something that had nothing to do with any of that external power. He built an inner fortress that power could not touch, that circumstance could not breach, that death itself could not destroy. He needed this fortress in the camps along the Danube. He needed it when he received reports of the dead, when he had to write letters to widows and orphans, when he had to order attacks knowing men would die, when he lay awake at night in pain from his ailments, wondering if he would live to see Rome again. The inner citadel was not a metaphor. It was a real place he retreated to, a real stability he had cultivated through years of practice. But let us be clear about what this inner citadel was not. It was not an escape from responsibility. It was not a way to avoid feeling, to become cold or inhuman. Marcus did not build this fortress so he could stop caring about the suffering around him. He built it so he could continue to care, continue to act, continue to bear the weight of command without being crushed by it. This is a distinction often missed in discussions of Stoicism. The goal is not to eliminate emotion or to become indifferent to what happens in the world. The goal is to maintain the capacity to act rationally and virtuously regardless of what we feel. Marcus felt grief when men died. He felt frustration when plans failed. He felt the burden of responsibility, the weight of countless lives depending on his decisions. The Stoic training did not make these feelings disappear. It gave him the ability to experience them without being controlled by them. There is a passage in the Meditations where Marcus reminds himself that he can endure anything his mind can endure, and his mind can endure anything if it judges correctly about what has happened. This is the key. The feelings will come, the pressure will build, the pain will be real. But if he maintains correct judgment, if he sees things as they truly are, if he keeps his reasoning faculty clear and unclouded, then he can bear whatever must be borne. This capacity to bear things is not the same as being unaffected by them. Marcus was affected. We see this in his writing, in the weariness that sometimes comes through, in the moments when he has to talk himself back from despair or anger. But he developed the ability to feel these things and still choose his response, to experience the pressure without being deformed by it. How did he develop this capacity? Through daily practice, through the same kind of training an athlete undertakes to develop physical skill. Every morning, he prepared his mind for the day ahead. Every evening, we can imagine, he reviewed what had happened, examined his own responses, identified where he had lived up to his principles and where he had fallen short. This is the Stoic practice of prosoke, attention, maintaining constant awareness of one's own thoughts and judgments. In modern terms, we might call this metacognition, the ability to observe our own thinking. But for the Stoics, it was more than observation. It was the active work of correcting judgments in real time, of catching ourselves when we start to form opinions that will harm us, of steering our minds back to truth when they drift toward distortion. Marcus practiced this constantly. We see it in the structure of the meditations itself, the way he circles back to the same themes, reminds himself of the same truths, works through the same problems from different angles. This is not the sign of a weak memory or a limited intellect. It is the sign of someone engaged in the daily work of maintaining philosophical practice under conditions that make such practice almost impossible. Consider what this means practically. Marcus is in a council of war, listening to reports from the frontier, hearing recommendations from his generals, trying to make a decision that could affect thousands of lives. In the midst of this, he must maintain his ability to think clearly, to judge accurately, to resist the subtle pressures of ego, fear, and ambition that cloud judgment even in the best of us. He has practiced for this moment. He has trained himself to notice when his thinking becomes distorted, when he starts to care too much about how he appears to others, when he starts to make decisions based on anger or spite rather than reason. He has developed the habit of pausing, of checking his impressions against Stoic principles, of asking himself what the virtuous choice would be rather than the convenient or self-serving one. This is philosophy as a lived practice, not as an intellectual exercise. It is philosophy doing the work it was always meant to do, guiding a human being toward virtue in real situations with real stakes. And it is hard work, work that never ends, work that must be renewed every day because the pressures never cease. The Stoics used the metaphor of the physician for the philosopher. Just as a physician must understand the body and how to heal it, the philosopher must understand the soul and how to keep it healthy. But understanding is not enough. A physician must actually practice medicine, must actually treat patients, must develop skill through experience. Similarly, the philosopher must actually practice philosophy, must actually apply it to the challenges of life, must develop virtue through repeated effort. Marcus was both patient and physician, treating himself daily for the ailments of the soul that warfare and power and responsibility inevitably caused. He diagnosed his own frustrations, his own fears, his own temptations toward cruelty or despair, and he prescribed the remedies the Stoic tradition had developed, the techniques of cognitive therapy that the Stoics had refined over centuries. When he felt anger at someone's incompetence, he reminded himself that all people act according to their nature, that we are all prone to error, that he himself has made countless mistakes. This is not making excuses for failure. It is maintaining perspective, preventing anger from clouding his judgment about what response is actually appropriate. When he felt despair at the scale of the problems facing him, he reminded himself that he could only do what he could do, that responsibility extends only to effort, not to results, that even if he fails, he can fail well with dignity and virtue intact. This is not giving up. It is protecting himself from the paralysis that comes from feeling overwhelmed. When he felt pride at a victory or shame at a defeat, he reminded himself that these externals do not determine his worth, that fame is empty, that posterity's judgment is irrelevant, that only his character matters and his character is measured by his choices, not by outcomes beyond his control. These were not mere consolations. They were the tools that allowed him to continue functioning at the highest level under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. They were what kept him sane when sanity was under constant assault. They were what allowed him to remain human when the machinery of war threatened to turn him into something less than human. We must not romanticize what Marcus faced. War is not ennobling. It does not bring out the best in people through some automatic process. War is trauma and chaos and the constant presence of death. It degrades, brutalizes, and destroys. The idea that it builds character is a pleasant fiction told to make the necessary evil seem less evil. What builds character is the deliberate effort to maintain it under pressure. War provides the pressure, sometimes more pressure than a human being can reasonably be expected to bear. But the pressure itself does not transform. Only our response to pressure transforms us, and that response must be chosen, cultivated, practiced until it becomes habitual. Marcus chose to respond to the pressure of war with philosophical practice. He chose to meet chaos with reason, fear with courage, temptation with justice, suffering with endurance. These were not automatic responses. They were the fruit of decades of training, and they required daily maintenance or they would atrophy. We see this in how often he writes about the need for constant practice. He compares philosophy to athletic training, to military drill, to the daily exercises that keep skills sharp. He knows that if he stops practicing, even briefly, he will lose ground. The default state of the human mind under stress is not rational virtue. It is reactive emotion, self-serving rationalization, the kind of thinking that leads to bad decisions and corrupted character. So he writes by lamplight in his tent after a long day of command. He writes not because he expects anyone to read it, but because the act of writing focuses his mind, makes explicit what might otherwise remain vague, crystallizes his understanding and his commitment. The writing itself is part of the practice, part of the daily work of maintaining the inner citadel. What did he write about in these moments? We have the meditations to show us, and what we find is striking in its honesty. He does not write like a sage who has achieved perfect equanimity. He writes like a man struggling, someone who must constantly remind himself of what he knows because he is in danger of forgetting it, someone who must talk himself back to sanity repeatedly because the insanity of war constantly threatens to overwhelm him. He reminds himself that life is short, that death could come at any moment, that he must act now with virtue because there may not be a later. This is not morbid pessimism. It is memento mori, the Stoic practice of remembering death to intensify life, to strip away the trivial and focus on what actually matters. In war, this practice takes on immediate relevance. Death is not an abstraction. It is present, visible, a constant possibility for Marcus himself and a certainty for many of the men under his command. How does this awareness affect his decision-making? It focuses him. It makes him less willing to waste time on petty concerns, on political maneuvering, on the kind of ego-driven behavior that consumes so much energy in normal circumstances. When death is present, pretense becomes harder to maintain. What matters becomes clearer, but it also burdens him. Every decision he makes about when to attack, when to hold back, when to accept terms of peace or reject them, these decisions determine who lives and who dies. He cannot avoid this responsibility. It is the essence of command, and so he must find a way to carry this burden without being destroyed by it. The Stoic answer is to do what virtue requires and accept the consequences. This sounds simple but requires enormous strength. It means making decisions based on principle rather than on what will make him look good or feel better. It means being willing to be misunderstood, criticized, even hated if that is what virtue demands. It means living with the knowledge that he will sometimes be wrong, that even his best judgment will sometimes lead to outcomes he regrets, and that he must own these outcomes while not being destroyed by them. This is the loneliness of command that Marcus faced, but it was a loneliness intensified by his philosophical commitment. A commander who cares only for victory or only for his own glory has a kind of simplicity in his decision-making. He knows what he wants and pursues it without internal conflict. But Marcus wanted to be good, to act justly, to maintain his character even as he commanded armies and made decisions that led to death. This created tensions that could not be resolved by any simple formula. He had to order men into situations where they would die. He had to make tactical decisions knowing that errors would cost lives. He had to balance the good of the empire against the lives of individuals, and there was no scale that could make these calculations clean or easy. He had to live in the gray areas where every choice involved loss, where virtue itself seemed sometimes to demand contradictory things. The Stoics recognized this difficulty. They wrote about hard cases, about situations where duties conflict, where we must choose between imperfect options. Their answer was to develop practical wisdom, phronesis, the ability to judge well in particular circumstances rather than trying to apply universal rules mechanically. But practical wisdom is not something you can simply read about and acquire. It develops through experience, through making hard choices and living with their consequences, through the kind of immersion in reality that Marcus experienced on the frontier. He learned, we can imagine, that philosophy does not eliminate difficulty. It provides tools for navigating difficulty without losing yourself. It gives you principles to orient by when the situation is too complex for simple answers. It trains your judgment so you can make better decisions, though never perfect ones. It helps you live with the weight of responsibility without being crushed, though the weight never becomes light. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about Marcus's practice during the wars. He was not trying to escape into philosophy, to use it as a retreat from the harsh realities of command. He was trying to bring philosophy into the midst of those realities, to practice it in the place where it was most needed and most difficult. He was testing whether Stoic principles could actually sustain a human being in the worst circumstances life offers. And the fact that he wrote the Meditations at all suggests that they could, though not easily and not without constant effort. The Meditations is evidence of successful practice precisely because it shows us the struggle. If Marcus had written a serene treatise about the peace he had achieved, we might doubt whether he really understood what he was writing about. But he wrote something else, a record of daily practice, of reminders he needed to hear repeatedly, of principles he had to recommit to every morning. This makes the Meditations perhaps the most honest philosophical document we have from the ancient world. It shows us philosophy not as it appears in the lecture hall but as it functions in life, messy and difficult and absolutely necessary. It shows us a human being trying to remain human under conditions that could easily dehumanize him, trying to hold on to virtue when virtue seems like an impossible luxury, trying to maintain his character when every external pressure pushes toward its corruption. The deep exploration we have undertaken in this segment has taken us into the heart of Marcus's practice during the Germanic Wars. We have seen how he used Stoic principles not as abstract ideas but as practical tools for maintaining his capacity to function, to lead, to make difficult decisions while preserving his character. We have seen the inner citadel not as a metaphor but as a real psychological structure he built through daily practice. We have also seen the cost of this practice, the constant effort it required, the way it demanded that Marcus remain vigilant about his own thoughts and judgments even as he managed the overwhelming complexity of military command. This was not philosophy as a pleasant intellectual exercise. This was philosophy as survival, as the difference between remaining who you are and being transformed into something lesser by the pressures you face. The Danube frontier stretched endlessly, a line of watchtowers and fortifications marking the boundary between Roman order and the restless tribes beyond. Marcus Aurelius knew every mile of this border, had walked its length in imagination during countless nights when sleep would not come. The river itself seemed to mirror the boundary he maintained within himself, the division between what could be controlled and what lay forever beyond his power to change. In the morning hours before dawn, when the camp still slept and only the sentries kept their watch, Marcus would sometimes walk alone among the tents. He moved quietly, his presence unannounced, observing the sleeping forms of soldiers who had placed their lives in his hands. The weight of this trust pressed upon him differently than the weight of empire. These men were not abstractions, not numbers in a military report. They were sons and brothers, husbands and fathers, each carrying within themselves a world as complete as his own. The Stoics had taught him to see all human beings as fellow citizens in the cosmopolis, the universal city of reason. Yet here, in the pre-dawn darkness of a military camp, this teaching took on a texture it had never possessed in the philosophy schools of Rome. These soldiers did not know they were citizens of a cosmic city. They knew cold and fear, hunger and homesickness. They knew the weight of armor and the terror of battle. They knew that their emperor walked among them in the darkness, and perhaps this knowledge gave them some small comfort. Marcus understood that leadership was not merely the exercise of authority. It was the constant practice of seeing truly, of perceiving both the particular and the universal, of holding in mind simultaneously the individual soldier and the necessity that had brought them all to this frozen frontier. The Stoic emperor could not indulge in sentimentality, could not let personal feeling cloud strategic judgment. Yet neither could he become so detached that he forgot the human reality of what he commanded. As he walked, he thought about the passage he would write later that morning, when the camp stirred to life and he could return to his tent with the legitimate excuse of reviewing dispatches. The writing had become essential to him now, not as a luxury or intellectual exercise, but as a practice of survival. In the act of putting words to parchment, he could maintain the clarity that leadership demanded. The meditations were not meant for others to read. This privacy freed him to be ruthlessly honest, to acknowledge fears and frustrations that an emperor could never voice aloud. On the page, he could admit his weariness, his moments of doubt, his longing for the peace and order of philosophical study. He could remind himself of principles that the chaos of war threatened to overwhelm. He could practice, in writing, the kind of thinking that would sustain him through another day of impossible decisions. The Germanic tribes were not the mindless barbarians that Roman propaganda sometimes painted them to be. Marcus had studied their tactics, learned their languages through interpreters, sought to understand the pressures that drove them southward against Roman borders. They too were human beings, seeking security for their families, responding to threats from tribes further east, navigating a world of scarcity and danger. This understanding complicated everything. It would have been easier, in some ways, to see them as purely evil, as forces of chaos opposing Roman order. But the Stoic emperor could not indulge in such simplifications. To see clearly meant to recognize that the tribes across the river were not so different from the Romans defending against them. Both groups were collections of human beings, each capable of reason, each seeking to preserve what they valued, each trapped in circumstances that seemed to leave no path but conflict. Yet this recognition did not paralyze Marcus into inaction. The Stoics taught that while all human beings shared in universal reason, this did not mean all choices were equally valid. Some ways of living aligned with nature and reason, while others led toward chaos and suffering. Roman civilization, whatever its flaws, represented an order based on law and philosophy. The alternative was not noble freedom but the endless cycle of tribal warfare, the rule of strength over justice, the triumph of immediate power over enduring principle. Marcus wrote about this tension frequently in his private notes. He reminded himself that doing what was necessary was not the same as doing it with hatred or cruelty. A Stoic could fight when fighting was required, could order harsh measures when circumstances demanded them, without allowing personal animosity to color his actions. The enemy was not evil. He was simply an obstacle to be managed according to reason and necessity. This distinction was not merely philosophical sophistication. It had practical implications for how the war was conducted. Marcus insisted on honorable treatment of prisoners, on keeping agreements even when breaking them might offer tactical advantage, on limiting destruction to what military necessity required. These were not acts of weakness but expressions of the same rational order that justified the war itself. His officers sometimes struggled to understand this. They had been trained in a military culture that saw ruthlessness as strength and mercy as dangerous indulgence. Marcus had to explain again and again that true strength lay not in unleashing force without restraint, but in applying it with precision and purpose. The goal was not to destroy the Germanic tribes but to secure the frontier, to create conditions in which peaceful coexistence became possible. This required a different kind of thinking than simple conquest demanded. It meant seeing years ahead, considering how today's actions would shape tomorrow's possibilities. It meant recognizing that every act of unnecessary cruelty created new enemies, that every broken promise weakened the very order Rome claimed to represent. The Stoic emperor fought not with passion but with patient, strategic rationality. In the tent that served as his headquarters, surrounded by maps and reports, Marcus faced decisions that no philosophical training could fully prepare him for. The Stoics had written extensively about virtue, about living in accordance with nature, about maintaining equanimity in the face of external events. But they had not provided detailed guidance on questions like these. How many soldiers should be committed to a particular engagement? When should negotiations be pursued and when abandoned? How much suffering was acceptable in pursuit of strategic objectives? Philosophy gave him principles, but principles required interpretation when applied to specific circumstances. The principle of acting justly did not tell him whether justice meant attacking now or waiting for better conditions. The principle of courage did not specify which risks were worth taking and which were foolish. The principle of wisdom did not automatically reveal which information to trust and which to discount. Marcus understood that this gap between principle and practice was exactly where character was formed and tested. Anyone could memorize Stoic maxims. The challenge was to internalize them so deeply that they shaped judgment even in situations the philosophers had never imagined. This required constant practice, constant reflection, constant refinement of understanding. His nightly writing sessions were this practice made visible. Each entry in the Meditations was an attempt to think through how Stoic principles applied to the specific challenges he faced. He wrote about anger, reminding himself to see it as a temporary disturbance rather than a justified response. He wrote about fear, analyzing it as a judgment about the future rather than a necessary reaction to danger. He wrote about death, both his own and that of others, seeking to maintain proper perspective on mortality's inevitability. These were not academic exercises. When he reminded himself that death was neither good nor bad but simply an indifferent, he was preparing himself to send men into battle knowing that some would not return. When he analyzed anger as mistaken judgment, he was working to maintain clarity when subordinates failed or circumstances frustrated carefully laid plans. When he reflected on the cosmic perspective from which all human affairs appeared small, he was seeking the emotional distance that would allow him to make decisions based on reason rather than passion. The tent was quiet except for the scratch of his stylus against wax tablet. Outside, the camp moved through its evening routines. Guards changed shifts. Soldiers gathered around fires to share their meager rations. Officers reviewed plans for tomorrow's operations. All of this activity depended on decisions that would be made here, in this small space, by a man trying to apply ancient wisdom to contemporary necessity. Marcus paused in his writing, considering the paradox of his position. He wielded enormous power, commanded vast resources, could alter the course of thousands of lives with a single order. Yet all this external power was ultimately insignificant compared to the inner work of maintaining his own rationality and virtue. The true battle was not against the Germanic tribes but against his own fear, anger, pride, and weariness. The practice of philosophy under these conditions taught Marcus something that no peaceful study could have revealed. It was easy to maintain Stoic equanimity when circumstances were favorable, when one had leisure and comfort and the support of like-minded companions. The true test came when every external condition opposed philosophical practice, when exhaustion and danger and responsibility pulled the mind toward reactive emotion rather than reflective reason. War stripped away the luxuries that could make philosophy seem easy. There was no beautiful garden for contemplation, no well-stocked library for reference, no community of scholars for discussion. There was mud and cold and the constant press of urgent demands. There was the weight of knowing that hesitation could cost lives, that mistakes could doom thousands, that the consequences of every decision rippled outward in ways impossible to fully predict. In such conditions, philosophy became purely practical or it became nothing at all. Marcus could not afford philosophical speculation for its own sake. Every principle had to prove its worth in application. Every teaching had to help him navigate actual situations. The The Stoicism he practiced on the Danube frontier was not the refined philosophical system of the schools, but something more fundamental, the basic practice of maintaining rationality when everything urged him toward panic or despair. He learned to recognize the signs of his mind slipping toward unhelpful patterns. There was a particular quality to the thoughts that arose when he was too tired, a tendency toward catastrophic thinking and overwhelming complexity. He learned to notice this and to step back, to simplify, to return to first principles. What was within his control? What did virtue require in this specific situation? What would he think of this decision looking back from the perspective of his own death? These questions became tools for recovering clarity when circumstances threatened to overwhelm judgment. They were not abstract philosophical exercises but practical techniques for maintaining the kind of mind that could lead effectively. Marcus wrote them down not to share them with others, but to make them available to himself in moments when memory alone might fail. The meditations preserved not only his insights but also his struggles. He wrote about the same challenges repeatedly, approaching them from different angles, reminding himself of truths that he kept forgetting. This repetition was not a sign of failure but recognition of how the mind worked under pressure. Philosophical understanding was not achieved once and possessed forever. It had to be renewed constantly, practiced daily, refreshed against the erosion of circumstance. Reading his own earlier entries, Marcus could see his progress and his persistence. Some insights appeared again and again, phrased slightly differently each time as he worked to find the formulation that would stick in memory. Some challenges he had written about months or years ago remained present, evidence that certain struggles were not meant to be overcome once but must be engaged continuously. The Stoic life was not about reaching a state of permanent tranquility, but about maintaining practice even when tranquility seemed impossible. Winter on the Danube brought a different kind of hardship than battle. The campaigning season ended not because wisdom dictated it, but because movement became impossible. Snow and ice locked the landscape into stillness. Supply lines became unreliable. The river that served as Rome's defensive barrier froze solid, creating a temporary bridge that made the frontier more vulnerable even as military operations ground to a halt. During these frozen months, Marcus faced the challenge of maintaining an army's readiness and morale when there was nothing to do but wait. Soldiers who had survived the fighting season now had to survive boredom, cold, and the anxious anticipation of spring's renewal of conflict. Discipline could fray under such conditions. Men turned against each other over small grievances. Despair could spread like disease through camps where nothing changed except the weather. The emperor's presence mattered during these months perhaps more than during active campaigning. When there was fighting to do, soldiers knew their purpose. When there was only waiting, they needed to see that their leader shared their hardship, that he too endured the cold and monotony, that the cause they served remained worth the suffering it demanded. Marcus could have withdrawn to more comfortable quarters. There were Roman cities not far from the frontier where he could have waited out the winter in relative luxury. But he understood that leadership was not merely giving orders. It was embodying the virtues that the situation required. If he asked soldiers to endure hardship, he must endure it alongside them. If he expected them to maintain discipline and purpose through months of uncomfortable waiting, he must demonstrate what such maintenance looked like. This was not martyrdom or performance. It was the practical application of Stoic principles to leadership. The Stoics taught that virtue was its own reward, that the wise person would choose right action regardless of external consequences. Marcus lived this teaching in full view of his army. He maintained his philosophical practice not in spite of the conditions but directly through them. His morning walks through the camp, his evening writing sessions, his consistent application of rational judgment to military decisions, these were all visible demonstrations that philosophy was not mere talk but a way of life that could sustain a person through the worst that fortune could deliver. The soldiers might not have understood Stoicism in philosophical terms, but they could see its effects. They could see an emperor who did not complain about conditions they all shared. They could see him making decisions with care and consistency rather than anger or caprice. They could see him treating subordinates and enemies alike with a stern but measured justice. These observations shaped the army's character more effectively than any orders or speeches could. Marcus understood that he was not only fighting a war against Germanic tribes. He was also engaged in the deeper work of maintaining civilization itself. Civilization was not primarily a matter of buildings and laws. It was the daily practice of choosing reason over violence, justice over expediency, measured response over reactive passion. An army could be either a force for civilization or its opposite, depending on how it was led. The letters that arrived from Rome brought news of a different world, one where political intrigue and philosophical debate continued as if the frontier war were a distant abstraction. Marcus read these letters with complex feelings. Part of him longed for that world of ideas and culture, for the refined conversations and intellectual stimulation that had shaped his youth. Part of him recognized how much that world depended on what was happening here, in these frozen camps along the Danube. Rome's philosophers and senators could debate the nature of virtue because soldiers stood between them and chaos. The libraries and schools, the theaters and temples, the entire infrastructure of civilized life existed only because people like these soldiers endured cold and danger to maintain the borders that made such things possible. This was not a romantic notion but a simple fact that Marcus lived with every day. Yet he could not allow himself to become bitter about this disparity. The Stoics taught that each person must play the role that circumstances assign them. His role was to be here, to lead, to make the decisions that others could not or would not make. Their role was to preserve and develop the culture that gave meaning to his sacrifices. Both roles were necessary. Neither was inherently superior. This perspective helped Marcus avoid the cynicism that could easily have consumed him. It would have been easy to look at the comfortable philosophers in Rome and think them hypocrites, teaching virtue while others died to protect their leisure. But such thoughts were not helpful and not entirely accurate. The philosophers preserved something worth protecting. They maintained traditions of rational inquiry and ethical reflection that elevated human life above mere survival. The fact that they did not fully appreciate the cost of their protection did not negate the value of what they protected. Marcus wrote about this in his Meditations, reminding himself to avoid the trap of resentment. Each person contributed according to their nature and circumstances. The philosopher who never saw battle might nevertheless develop insights that helped the warrior maintain his humanity. The soldier who never read philosophy might nevertheless embody virtues that the philosopher could only discuss in theory. Both were part of the larger whole, the cosmopolis that included all reasoning beings. This cosmic perspective was not detachment but a different kind of engagement. By seeing his own role as part of a larger pattern, Marcus could avoid the emotional extremes that made leadership impossible. He could act decisively without being consumed by the drama of action. He could care deeply about outcomes without being destroyed when outcomes disappointed expectations. He could remain fully present to the demands of his situation while maintaining the internal distance that reason required. The winter nights were long, and in them Marcus often reflected on time itself. How strange that this freezing moment, this particular configuration of circumstances and challenges, would someday be past. If he survived, he would look back on these years as a completed episode, their struggles resolved one way or another. If he did not survive, others would continue the work, would face their own impossible situations, would discover whether they too could maintain philosophical practice under pressure. The Stoics had taught Marcus to practice the view from above, imagining himself looking down on the vast scope of human activity from a cosmic perspective. From such a height, the war on the Danube would appear as a small disturbance, no more significant than waves on the ocean's surface. Rome itself, with all its grandeur and complexity, would seem tiny against the immensity of space and time. Even the span of human history, from the first civilizations to whatever distant future awaited, would occupy barely a moment in the life of the cosmos. This meditation could seem to diminish the importance of everything he was doing, to reduce his efforts to meaningless activity in an indifferent universe. But Marcus had learned to understand it differently. The cosmic perspective did not make human affairs meaningless. It made them properly meaningful. By seeing his situation against the background of eternity, he could distinguish between what truly mattered and what only seemed urgent. What mattered was not whether he succeeded in every tactical objective or whether history would remember him favorably. What mattered was whether he maintained his character, whether he acted according to reason and virtue, whether he responded to circumstances with wisdom and justice. These things were within his control and genuinely important. They determined the quality of his life regardless of external outcomes. The war would end someday one way or another. Rome would endure or fall according to patterns too vast for any individual to determine. But his choices about how to think and act in response to the situation before him, these were his and his alone. No amount of external pressure could force him to abandon reason unless he chose to do so. No hardship could destroy his virtue unless he permitted it. This was the freedom that philosophy promised, not freedom from circumstances but freedom in how one met them. Marcus had discovered that this freedom required constant practice. The mind naturally inclined toward reactive patterns, toward anger at obstacles and fear of threats and attachment to preferred outcomes. These reactions were not wrong exactly, but they were not fully rational. They arose from the part of the mind that evolution had shaped for survival, not for wisdom. Philosophy offered a different way of processing experience, one based on careful judgment rather than immediate reaction. In the midst of war, with all its chaos and urgency, Marcus practiced this different way of being. When news arrived of a setback, he practiced observing his initial reaction without being controlled by it. When faced with a difficult decision, he practiced separating what was known from what was imagined, what was controllable from what was not. When exhausted and tempted to give up on philosophical practice, he practiced remembering why it mattered. The meditations captured this practice in writing, but the writing was only the visible part of a larger internal discipline. Everything Marcus did, From how he walked through the camp to how he received reports to how he delivered orders, was shaped by the ongoing work of maintaining philosophical awareness. He was not trying to become perfect. He was trying to remain awake to his own thinking, to catch himself when he slipped into unhelpful patterns, to keep returning to the clarity that reason offered. This, he thought, was what it meant to be a philosopher king, not someone who had mastered all knowledge or achieved perfect wisdom, but someone who brought philosophical practice into the messy reality of power and responsibility. It meant showing that philosophy was not escapism but the deepest form of engagement with life. We have journeyed through the frozen nights of Marcus's Germanic campaigns, through the philosophical foundations he maintained even as chaos surrounded him, through the deep wells of Stoic teaching that sustained him when exhaustion threatened to overcome reason. Now we turn toward the practical application of these principles, toward the question that matters most. How do we actually live this philosophy when our own battles arrive? Marcus never wrote the Meditations as a manual for others. He wrote to remind himself night after night of the principles he needed to embody when morning came. Yet precisely because he was writing for himself, because he was wrestling with real difficulties rather than constructing abstract theories, his words carry a weight of practical wisdom that purely academic philosophy often lacks. Consider what it means to practice philosophy under genuine pressure. Not the pressure of an examination or a debate, but the pressure of consequences that matter deeply. Marcus faced decisions that would determine whether soldiers lived or died, whether the empire's borders held or collapsed, whether stability or chaos would prevail. He could not retreat into contemplation. He had to act, and his actions had to be informed by wisdom even when time did not permit leisurely reflection. This is where philosophy proves its worth or reveals its emptiness. A philosophy that functions only in comfortable circumstances, that requires perfect conditions to be practiced, is hardly philosophy at all. It is intellectual decoration. The Stoics understood this from the beginning. Zeno developed his teachings in a painted porch in Athens, but those teachings were meant to function in storms at sea, in political upheaval, in personal tragedy, in war. Marcus tested Stoicism in conditions more extreme than most of us will ever face. He tested it when illness ravaged his camps, when supply lines failed, when trusted advisors died, when military setbacks threatened years of careful planning. He tested it when his own body betrayed him with pain and exhaustion, when sleep deprivation made clear thinking difficult, when the weight of responsibility for thousands of lives pressed down upon his shoulders. The philosophy held, not because it made these difficulties disappear, but because it provided a framework for facing them with dignity and reason intact. This is the first practical lesson we can extract from Marcus's example. Philosophical practice is not about creating ideal conditions, but about maintaining wisdom within whatever conditions actually exist. When we speak of practical application, we are asking how to translate Stoic principles into actual behavior when the moment demands response. How do we pause long enough to distinguish what we control from what we do not, when events are moving rapidly? How do we maintain perspective when we are caught in circumstances that feel overwhelming? How do we remember that we are mortal beings in a vast universe when our immediate concerns seem all-consuming? Marcus's method was essentially this. He reminded himself constantly and deliberately of the principles that mattered most. He did not assume that understanding a principle once was sufficient. He returned to fundamental truths again and again, not because he had forgotten them, but because forgetting them under pressure was always possible. The human mind, under stress, tends to narrow its focus, to lose sight of larger contexts, to react rather than respond thoughtfully. The practical discipline begins with recognizing this tendency in ourselves. We are most likely to abandon our principles precisely when following them would be most valuable. When someone treats us unjustly, we are tempted to respond with anger rather than remembering that they, too, are acting according to their understanding. When events disappoint us, we are inclined to indulge in frustration rather than accepting that external outcomes were never fully within our control. When tired or hungry or in pain, we are prone to irritability rather than recognizing that physical discomfort need not dictate our character. Marcus knew these temptations intimately. He experienced them in circumstances far more challenging than most of our daily frustrations. He was tired beyond measure, hungry when supplies ran low, in pain from chronic illness, surrounded by death and suffering, responsible for decisions that would haunt him regardless of which option he chose. Yet he continued to practice the philosophical discipline of self-examination and self-correction. This practice was not about achieving perfection. Marcus knew himself well enough to understand that he would fail, would lose his temper, would make decisions he later regretted, would fall short of the ideal he held before himself. The practice was about returning again and again to reason and principle. It was about making the next decision with wisdom, regardless of whether the previous decision had been wise. It was about maintaining the effort toward virtue even when virtue itself remained partially out of reach. There is something deeply encouraging in this for those of us attempting to practice philosophy in our own lives. We do not need to be perfect. We need to be persistent. We need to continue examining our thoughts and actions, continue correcting our course when we drift, continue recommitting ourselves to what we believe matters most. The practice is the thing, not the perfect execution. Consider a practical example from everyday life, something far less dramatic than Marcus's wartime challenges, yet philosophically similar in structure. You are working on a project that matters to you. You have invested significant time and effort. Circumstances beyond your control threaten its success. Perhaps a colleague fails to deliver what they promised. Perhaps unexpected obstacles arise. Perhaps the timeline becomes impossible. You face a choice. You can respond with anger at the colleague, with frustration at the circumstances, with anxiety about the outcome. These are natural responses, understandable reactions. But are they helpful? Do they improve the situation? Do they reflect the person you wish to be? The Stoic approach, as Marcus practiced it, would be to pause long enough to distinguish what remains within your control. You cannot control what has already happened. You cannot control another person's reliability or competence. You cannot control all the variables that affect outcomes, but you can control your response. You can control whether you bring wisdom or reactivity to the present moment. You can control whether you focus your energy on what can still be influenced or waste it on what cannot. This pause, this moment of philosophical reflection before responding, is the practical heart of Stoicism. It is not about suppressing emotion or pretending difficulties do not matter. It is about creating space between stimulus and response, space in which reason can function. Marcus created this space for himself by writing, by thinking through situations on the page, by reminding himself of principles that provided perspective. We need not write to create this space, though writing can certainly help. We need only to develop the habit of pausing, of asking ourselves what this situation actually demands of us, of considering what response would align with our deepest values rather than our surface reactions. This habit, practiced consistently, becomes stronger over time. It becomes more accessible even in difficult moments, more reliable even under pressure. Another practical application concerns how we relate to other people, especially when they create difficulties for us. Marcus had to work with generals who disagreed with his strategies, with senators who opposed his policies, with advisors who sometimes gave poor counsel, with soldiers who occasionally failed in their duties. He could not simply dismiss or replace everyone who disappointed him. He had to find ways to work with imperfect people toward important goals. The Stoic approach he followed was to remember that every person acts according to their own understanding of what is good. When someone opposes us, they are not necessarily malicious. They may simply see the situation differently. When someone fails to meet our expectations, they may be struggling with limitations we do not fully understand. When someone treats us poorly, they may be acting from pain or confusion or their own unexamined patterns of behavior. This perspective does not excuse harmful behavior or eliminate the need for accountability. Marcus still had to discipline soldiers who violated standards, still had to navigate political opposition, still had to make difficult decisions about who to trust with responsibility. But approaching others with understanding rather than immediate judgment allowed him to respond more effectively. It reduced the emotional charge of interpersonal difficulties. It helped him focus on solutions rather than dwelling on grievances. In practical terms, this means asking ourselves different questions when someone creates a problem for us. Instead of asking why they are being so difficult, we might ask what circumstances are shaping their behavior. Instead of assuming malice, we might consider incompetence, confusion, or competing pressures. Instead of taking their actions personally, we might recognize that they are dealing with their own challenges and uncertainties. This shift in perspective often reveals options we might otherwise miss. The colleague who failed to deliver might be overwhelmed and need assistance rather than criticism. The family member who seems unreasonable might be acting from fear that they have not named. The stranger who treats us rudely might be carrying burdens we cannot see. Approaching them with curiosity rather than defensiveness creates possibilities for better outcomes. Marcus also practiced this perspective toward himself. He recognized his own limitations without being paralyzed by them. He knew he was not the philosopher-emperor he idealized. He knew his temper was imperfect, his energy limited, his judgment sometimes clouded by fatigue or illness. He worked with himself as he was, not as he wished to be, while still maintaining the effort toward improvement. This is profoundly practical. Many of us abandon philosophical practice because we hold ourselves to impossible standards. We fail once and conclude we are not philosophical types. We experience anger and decide Stoicism does not work for us. We make a poor decision and assume we lack the discipline for this path. But philosophy is not about instant perfection. It is about gradual cultivation of wisdom through persistent effort. When we fail to live up to our principles, the Stoic response is not shame or abandonment of the effort. It is acknowledgement of the failure, examination of what led to it, and renewed commitment to doing better. Marcus modeled this in his meditations, repeatedly reminding himself of principles he had clearly failed to embody perfectly. He was not pretending to be someone he was not. He was working to become who he believed he should be, knowing the work would never be complete. Consider how this applies to the ordinary frustrations of daily life. Traffic that makes you late. Technology that fails at an inconvenient moment. Weather that disrupts your plans. Someone who takes the parking space you were waiting for. A minor illness that forces you to cancel something you were looking forward to. These small annoyances are opportunities to practice the same philosophical principles Marcus applied to war and plague and the burdens of empire. They are opportunities to notice your initial reaction and choose whether to indulge it. They are chances to practice distinguishing between what you control and what you do not. They are moments when you can either strengthen your philosophical discipline or let it atrophy through disuse. The traffic is not within your control, but your response to it is. The technology failure is frustrating, but you can choose whether to let frustration dominate your thinking. The weather cares nothing for your plans, but you can adapt without losing your equanimity. This might seem like small stakes compared to Marcus's challenges, and in one sense it is. But in another sense, these small moments are exactly where character is formed or dissolved. Marcus did not become capable of philosophical practice during war by starting with war. He developed the habit through years of smaller practices, through daily disciplines, through countless moments when he chose principle over impulse. When the extreme circumstances arrived, the habits were already established. We do the same by practicing with what we actually face. If you are not currently at war, practice with traffic. If you are not currently governing an empire, practice with family dynamics and workplace challenges. If you are not currently facing death by plague, practice with illness and the inevitable physical declines of aging. The philosophical principles are the same regardless of scale. The practice is the same. The cultivation of wisdom proceeds through whatever circumstances life actually provides. Another practical application concerns how we approach our work and responsibilities. Marcus could not abandon his duties as emperor just because he found them burdensome or because philosophical practice seemed more appealing. His responsibility was clear, and philosophy had to function within that responsibility, not as an escape from it. This is important for us to understand, because there is a temptation to treat philosophy as a retreat from the world rather than as a framework for engaging with it more wisely. Stoicism does not teach us to care less about our work or to minimize our responsibilities. It teaches us to approach them with proper perspective, to do what is ours to do without being consumed by anxiety about outcomes we cannot fully control. Marcus led armies and governed provinces and made countless administrative decisions, all while maintaining his philosophical practice. The practice informed his decisions rather than distracting him from them. In practical terms, this means bringing philosophical awareness into whatever work you do. It means recognizing that the work itself is neither good nor bad in the Stoic sense, but that how you approach it reflects your character. You can be present to your responsibilities or resentful of them. You can bring care and attention to tasks or perform them with minimum grudging effort. The Stoic choice is to do what is yours to do with excellence, not because external rewards are guaranteed, but because excellence reflects who you are choosing to be. Marcus governed with attention and care not because he could control all outcomes, but because governing with attention and care was the appropriate response to the responsibility he held. When we bring this same spirit to our own work, whatever its nature, we practice philosophy in action rather than merely in contemplation. This also means accepting that our best effort may not produce the results we hope for. Marcus led campaigns that ended in stalemate. He implemented policies that did not solve all the problems they addressed. He made decisions that history would later criticize. But the measure of his philosophical practice was not whether everything turned out perfectly. It was whether he approached his responsibilities with reason, justice, courage, and moderation regardless of outcomes. We can apply this same standard to ourselves. When we complete a project that does not receive the recognition we think it deserves, we practice accepting outcomes we do not control while maintaining pride in the effort we did control. When we treat someone with kindness and they do not respond with gratitude, we practice virtue for its own sake rather than for external validation. When we work diligently toward a goal and fall short, we practice distinguishing our effort from results that depend on factors beyond our reach. There is a quiet freedom in this approach. We are no longer held hostage by outcomes we cannot control. We are no longer devastated when external circumstances do not align with our hopes. We can still prefer certain outcomes, still work toward them with full effort, but our peace of mind does not depend on achieving them. Our character, our integrity, our philosophical practice continues regardless of what fortune provides or withholds. Marcus understood this freedom deeply. He wrote that the mind that maintains its principles maintains its fortress, that nothing can conquer the soul that refuses to be conquered. This was not empty rhetoric for him. This was tested truth, proven in the most difficult circumstances imaginable. He found that peace, that unassailable fortress of character, not in favorable conditions but in philosophical discipline maintained when conditions were harshly unfavorable. As we move toward the integration of everything we have explored, as we prepare to gather these insights into a coherent understanding of what Marcus's example offers us, let us remember that practical application is not about dramatic transformation. It is about small, consistent choices, daily practices, moments of awareness and realignment. It is about remembering, in the midst of our own battles, whatever form they take, that we have the capacity to respond with wisdom rather than react with impulse. The frozen nights of the Marcomannic campaigns are long past. The campfires where Marcus wrote by flickering light are cold and gone. But the principles he practiced, the wisdom he cultivated, the example he set of philosophy under ultimate pressure, these remain available to us. They remain available not as abstract ideals but as practical tools for living with greater wisdom, greater dignity, greater peace regardless of what circumstances we face. The application of these principles begins now, in this moment, with whatever challenge or opportunity stands before us. We have traveled together through landscapes of reflection, across the cold terrains where Marcus Aurelius once stood with stylus and wax tablet, writing by firelight while war surrounded him. We have explored what it means to maintain a philosophical life when circumstances demand everything from us, when the gap between our inner commitments and outer chaos stretches wide and threatening. Now we arrive at integration, at the place where understanding becomes practice, where the concepts we have examined settle into something more lasting than intellectual agreement. This is not conclusion but continuation, the recognition that what Marcus discovered on the Danube frontier remains available to us wherever we find ourselves tested. The essence of what we have explored rests in a simple but profound recognition. Philosophy is not something separate from life, not an ornamental addition to existence, but the very practice of living with intention and awareness. Marcus demonstrated this not through perfection but through persistent effort, through returning again and again to his philosophical commitments even when exhausted, even when every circumstance seemed designed to pull him away from reflection. Consider what this means for how we understand our own struggles. We often imagine that philosophical practice requires ideal conditions, quiet spaces, freedom from pressing demands. We tell ourselves that we will return to deeper considerations when life becomes less chaotic, when responsibilities lighten, when circumstances improve. Marcus shows us the flaw in this postponement. He wrote his meditations precisely because conditions were terrible, because he needed philosophy most urgently when everything external had become difficult and demanding. This reverses our usual thinking. Instead of treating philosophy as something for calm moments, Marcus engaged it as the very tool for creating inner calm amid outer turbulence. The meditations were not written in peaceful retirement but in active command, not in security but in constant uncertainty. They represent philosophy under maximum pressure, thought sustained through exhaustion, principle maintained through endless challenge. What sustained him was not special strength but specific practices. He had trained himself to notice his judgments, to question his initial reactions, to pause before the space between stimulus and response closed. This training did not eliminate difficulty, but it changed his relationship to difficulty. Problems remained problems, but they did not become catastrophes. Setbacks remained setbacks, but they did not become evidence of cosmic injustice or personal failure. The dichotomy of control operated for Marcus not as abstract theory but as practical tool, something he returned to whenever confusion threatened. Faced with military reversals, political betrayals, physical illness, and personal losses, he repeatedly asked the fundamental question: what here lies within my control and what does not? This question did not solve external problems, but it clarified where his effort could be meaningfully applied. In recognizing what lay outside his control, Marcus found not helplessness but freedom. He could release the mental burden of trying to control the uncontrollable. He could stop exhausting himself through resistance to what had already occurred or through anxiety about what might never happen. This release was not resignation but realism, the acceptance of reality as the starting point for effective action rather than something to be mentally protested. What remained within his control was precisely what mattered most. His own responses, his judgments, his choices about how to meet each moment. This sphere of control was smaller than ego wished but larger than despair suggested. It was enough. Within this limited domain, genuine excellence remained possible. External circumstances could make life difficult, but they could not force him to abandon his principles unless he chose that abandonment himself. This understanding of limited control connected directly to how Marcus approached leadership. He could not control whether his soldiers would live or die, whether battles would be won or lost, whether the empire would ultimately survive or collapse. These outcomes depended on innumerable factors beyond any individual's direction. But he could control the quality of his leadership, the thoughtfulness of his decisions, the integrity with which he exercised power. This created a paradox that resolves only through philosophical clarity. As emperor and military commander, Marcus bore immense responsibility for outcomes that were ultimately not within his control. He had to make decisions affecting thousands of lives while recognizing that events would unfold according to their own logic, shaped by factors he could neither predict nor direct. Lesser leaders might have been paralyzed by this tension or might have hidden from it through pretensions of total control. Marcus found a third way. He could hold responsibility seriously while simultaneously recognizing its limits. He could work diligently toward good outcomes while accepting that results would manifest as they would. This was not contradiction but integration, the combination of committed action with philosophical detachment. He did his work without mistaking himself for the ultimate determiner of how reality would unfold. This balance appears in the Meditations as a recurring theme. Do what is required of you. Fulfill your role, act according to nature and reason, but do not become attached to specific outcomes as the measure of your worth. Value shows itself in the quality of effort, not in results that depend on fortune. An emperor who rules justly has succeeded philosophically even if his empire ultimately fails. A commander who leads thoughtfully has acted excellently even if battles are lost. For those of us who do not command armies or rule empires, this principle applies with equal force. We face our own versions of the emperor's dilemma whenever we bear responsibility for outcomes we cannot fully control. Parents cannot control how their children will ultimately develop. Teachers cannot control whether students will embrace learning. Professionals cannot control whether their best efforts will produce desired results. The temptation is either to claim false control or to abandon responsibility entirely. The Stoic alternative maintains full effort while releasing attachment to outcomes. We do our work as well as we can, bring our best judgment to each decision, act according to our principles, and then allow reality to unfold as it will. This is not easy because ego continually inserts itself, claiming credit for successes and feeling devastated by failures, as if we stood at the center of causation rather than as one contributing factor among many. Marcus modeled something different. Throughout the Marcomannic Wars, he faced military challenges that would stretch across more than a decade, with no guarantee of resolution. He could not simply win and go home. The situation demanded sustained effort without clear endpoint, continued leadership through ongoing uncertainty. This required a kind of patience that goes deeper than mere waiting. It required the capacity to continue acting well even when action produced no immediate visible progress. Consider how radical this is as a life stance. We are conditioned to expect that effort should produce prompt results, that problems should yield to sustained attention, that difficulty should be temporary rather than structural. We measure success by outcomes achieved, goals reached, problems solved. But much of life does not follow this pattern. Many of the most important aspects of existence involve ongoing practice rather than completed achievement. Marcus understood this. His philosophical work was not about reaching some final state of wisdom and then being done. It was about daily practice, continual return to basic principles, persistent effort to live according to reason even when emotion pulled him elsewhere. The Meditations record not a triumphant arrival but a sustained journey, the same lessons examined from different angles, the same reminders offered to himself repeatedly. This repetition was not failure but recognition of how philosophical practice actually works. We do not learn these lessons once and then possess them permanently. We learn them, forget them, relearn them, apply them inconsistently, lose our grip on them under pressure, and return to them again. This cycle is not evidence that the philosophy does not work. It is how the philosophy works, through repeated engagement rather than sudden permanent transformation. What made Marcus effective was not that he never struggled, but that he had a system for returning to center when he noticed himself pulled off course. When he felt angry, he had methods for examining that anger. When he felt discouraged, he had frameworks for questioning that discouragement. When he felt tempted to abuse power, he had principles that called him back to justice. The philosophy did not prevent these challenges from arising, but it provided tools for working with them when they appeared. This is perhaps the most practical insight we can take from Marcus's example. We need not be free from difficulty to practice philosophy effectively. We need not have achieved some rarefied state of constant tranquility. We need only the willingness to notice when we have lost our philosophical orientation and the tools to work our way back to it. This is always available, regardless of external circumstances. The inner citadel that Marcus cultivated was not a place of permanent residence, but a home base to which he could return. He ventured out into the chaos of command, into the demands of imperial administration, into the emotional turbulence of human relationship, and then returned to this inner space for renewal and reorientation. The citadel was not meant to be a refuge from life, but a foundation for engaging life more effectively. We can build our own version of this inner space, regardless of our circumstances or responsibilities. It does not require physical solitude, though moments of quiet help. It does not require freedom from demands, though respite from constant pressure allows deeper reflection. What it requires is the recognition that we possess an inner dimension that external events cannot directly touch, a capacity for reasoned judgment that remains ours even when everything else has been stripped away. This inner dimension is not about feelings, which arise and pass according to their own patterns. It is not about circumstances, which change according to countless factors beyond our control. It is about how we choose to meet whatever arises, the perspective we bring to experience, the principles we use to guide our responses. This remains accessible even in the most constrained external conditions. Marcus demonstrated this in extreme form. Even as emperor, with all the apparent power that position entailed, he faced limitations and constraints that would have crushed someone without philosophical resources. He could not prevent plague from devastating the empire. He could not keep his wife from likely infidelity or his son from becoming a problematic heir. He could not end the wars quickly or eliminate the constant threats facing Rome. His power was real but limited, impressive but insufficient to solve the problems he faced. What he could do was maintain his own character through all of this. He could treat people justly even when frustrated. He could make thoughtful decisions even when exhausted. He could continue acting according to principle even when expedience tempted him otherwise. This sphere of genuine control was smaller than his title suggested, but more significant than external achievements could measure. For us, the parallel is direct. We may feel powerless in many aspects of our lives, buffeted by circumstances we did not choose and cannot change. But we possess this same capacity Marcus exercised. We can choose our responses. We can question our automatic judgments. We can act according to values rather than being purely reactive. This power is real even when everything else feels uncertain. The practice involves bringing philosophical awareness to ordinary moments rather than reserving it for dramatic situations. Marcus wrote his reflections not only about great matters of state but about everyday frustrations, about difficult people in his life, about his own irritation with minor annoyances. He understood that character is built through small choices more than grand gestures, that we train ourselves through daily practice for whatever larger challenges might come. This suggests a different approach to how we structure our own philosophical practice. Rather than waiting for significant challenges to apply Stoic principles, we can work with whatever the day presents. Traffic delays become opportunities to practice patience. Disagreements become chances to question our immediate judgments. Minor disappointments become training grounds for acceptance. None of this is glamorous, but it is precisely through these unglamorous moments that philosophical capacity develops. Marcus recognized that philosophy must be practiced in the texture of actual life, or it remains merely intellectual. The Meditations show someone working with real situations, real emotions, real difficulties. He did not write abstract treatises on virtue, but personal reminders about how to handle specific challenges. This groundedness made his philosophy functional rather than ornamental. What emerges from this approach is not the elimination of difficulty, but a changed relationship to it. Problems do not disappear, but they lose their power to completely disrupt our inner equilibrium. We can feel frustrated without being controlled by frustration. We can experience disappointment without interpreting it as catastrophe. We can face genuine hardship without abandoning our fundamental commitments. This is the real measure of philosophical progress, not perfect tranquility but increased resilience, not the absence of negative emotions but the capacity to work with them without being swept away. Marcus still felt anger, fear, grief, and frustration. The Meditations record these feelings honestly, but he had developed the ability to notice these emotions arising, to question the judgments underlying them, and to choose his responses rather than simply reacting. Such capacity develops slowly, through repeated practice rather than sudden insight. We do not read about Stoic principles once and then embody them perfectly. We read, practice, fail, notice our failures, practice again, improve slightly, backslide, notice the backsliding, and continue. This process continues throughout life, not because we are doing it wrong, but because this is what the process actually looks like. Marcus engaged this process for his entire adult life. Even in his final years, writing on campaign, he was still reminding himself of basic principles, still working to apply them more consistently, still noticing when he fell short. This was not the record of someone who had failed to grasp Stoicism properly. It was the record of someone who understood that philosophical practice is exactly this: ongoing, imperfect, valuable work. As we consider what we have explored together across these hours, certain themes emerge as particularly relevant for our own practice. The first is simply that practice itself matters more than perfect understanding. We do not need complete philosophical clarity before beginning to apply Stoic principles. We start where we are with whatever understanding we currently possess, and that beginning is enough. Understanding deepens through application rather than preceding it. Second, we recognize that difficult circumstances do not disqualify us from philosophical practice, but instead provide the necessary context for that practice to become real. If Marcus could engage philosophy while commanding armies in brutal winter campaigns, while managing an empire in crisis, while dealing with personal losses and physical illness, then we can engage it in our own challenging situations. We do not need ideal conditions. We need only willingness to begin where we are. Third, we acknowledge that philosophical work is daily work, showing itself more in small, consistent choices than in dramatic moments. We build the inner citadel through ordinary decisions, through how we handle minor frustrations, through whether we act according to principle when no one is watching. These small exercises prepare us for larger challenges, though we do not practice merely for some future test. The practice itself is the point. Fourth, we embrace repetition as part of the process rather than evidence of failure. We will return to the same insights repeatedly, remind ourselves of the same principles many times, notice ourselves forgetting what we thought we had learned. This is normal. This is how human learning actually works, especially for wisdom that must be embodied rather than merely intellectually grasped. Finally, we understand that this work is never complete but always available. There is no graduation from philosophical practice, no point at which we have mastered it and can stop. But neither is there any point at which we are permanently disqualified. Each moment offers a fresh opportunity to bring awareness and intention to how we meet experience. Each moment we can return to our philosophical foundations, regardless of how far we have wandered from them. This teaching, drawn from Marcus's example on the Danube frontier, remains as relevant now as when those reflections were first written by firelight between military engagements. The external details differ vastly. We do not face barbarian invasions or command legions, but we face our own versions of chaos and pressure, our own tests of whether we can maintain our principles when circumstances make that maintenance difficult. What Marcus offers is not a promise that philosophy will make life easy or eliminate challenges. He offers something more valuable, a demonstration that principled living remains possible even under the most demanding conditions, that inner freedom can coexist with external constraint, that we can face difficulty with dignity and purpose rather than being crushed by it. The meditations themselves stand as proof of this possibility. They exist because Marcus chose to maintain his philosophical practice even when exhausted, even when every excuse for abandoning reflection would have been understandable. He wrote not because he had achieved perfect wisdom, but because he needed these reminders to continue his own imperfect efforts at living philosophically. We inherit this example not as an impossible standard, but as encouragement. If Marcus, bearing the full weight of empire during its crisis, could find moments to write and reflect, could maintain his commitment to virtue under such pressure, then we can find ways to engage our own philosophical practice within our own circumstances. Not perfectly, not without struggle, but genuinely and with persistent effort. As these reflections come to rest, we recognize that nothing has been concluded but rather opened. The exploration of how philosophy functions under pressure, how principles can be maintained through chaos, how inner peace can be cultivated even amid outer turmoil. These are not topics we have finished, but themes we have begun to live with more intentionally. Marcus returns to his writing, somewhere in our imagination, seated by a campfire on the edge of empire, stylus in hand, working once more through the fundamental questions of how to live well. His example continues quietly, not demanding but available, showing us that philosophical practice remains possible whatever our circumstances, that the inner citadel can be built and maintained through steady effort, that character can be preserved through difficulty by those willing to make that preservation their consistent aim. The work continues, for Marcus in his time, for us in ours. The principles remain sound, tested by centuries of human experience, proven not through abstract argument but through application under pressure. We take them up as Marcus did, not as absolute guarantees but as reliable guides, not as magical solutions but as practical tools for living more deliberately and wisely. In this continuity across time, we find both humility and confidence. Humility because the work is never finished, because we will struggle as Marcus struggled, because perfection is not the measure. Confidence because the path is clear, the practices are available, the possibility of philosophical living remains real regardless of circumstances. The fire burns low, the night deepens. Somewhere beyond philosophical reflection, life continues with all its demands and difficulties, its uncertainties and challenges. But we return to that life slightly changed, carrying with us the recognition that we possess resources for meeting whatever comes, that inner freedom remains available, that we can choose our responses even when we cannot choose our circumstances. This is enough. This is more than enough. This is the quiet gift that Marcus Aurelius, writing by firelight 2,000 years ago, still offers to those willing to receive it. The possibility of living philosophically whatever our conditions, the practice of maintaining character through chaos, the steady work of building and inhabiting the inner citadel that no external force can breach.